Hello and welcome to Vox Markets. I am John Hewman and I'm delighted to be joined again by Craig Martin of Dynam Capital, which operates Vietnam Holdings Investment Trust. How are you doing, Craig?
I'm doing great, John. Thanks ever so much.
Excellent. Thanks for coming on again. So today we're going to talk about ESG because you've been very active in this space for a long time, but very recently the lead sponsor and keynote speaker at Vietnam's inaugural ESG conference. Tell us all about it, Craig.
Well, look, it's very exciting. For it to be the first inaugural conference, I don't think we were expecting as big a turnout as we got. We had 350 participants over 2 days of a conference. And often the second day of a conference, everyone's a bit sleepy or zoned out. But each of the sessions that the organizers had put together were really well attended. So they did a great job. And we were very proud to be sponsoring it. And I got to speak at the keynote to really talk about Vietnam's journey within ESG, and particularly Vietnam Holding, our approach, which, as you say, has been a long-term approach, and some of the fruit we're starting to see emerge in our portfolio as a result of those very early efforts.
I mean, we've spoken before about ESG and you know how you're very, very sort of actively encouraging that within your portfolio companies. Why does let's go back to why it matters in terms of your investment philosophy, but also more broadly for Vietnam.
Well, look, obviously globally, ESG is such a major theme, and there's a lot of assets now allocated to ESG, and many signatories to organizations such as United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing. And there is a danger that, there's accusations of greenwashing and everyone's on the ESG bandwagon. We can say for Vietnam Holdings perspective, we were the first fund in Vietnam to adopt the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investing well over a decade ago. And for my colleague Tin, it was a hard journey to convince many of the companies in Vietnam what it was all about back then, over a decade ago. Why should we bother about the environment, governance? What does all this mean? But Tin is a very tremendous individual and very persistent, and had co-founded the Vietnam Institute of Directors. So we started off really on the governance front, trying to explain to portfolio companies, that over time they need to raise their game. There'll be more scrutiny, and it's better for shareholders to have a good dialogue with the companies. So Tin and my colleagues have been really pushing on this, to particularly on the G side, the G in the governance, provide training, suggest that they should be independent directors of some of these public companies, but also holding them to account when we meet with them regularly about what they're doing. And for us as an investor, it's very selfish. There's over 1,600 public companies in Vietnam, and we've got a portfolio of 20 to 30. So we've got to do a lot of filtering. And we found that ESG actually is quite a good tool to filter the great from the good and the good from the bad, and then to help you keep on track of those, and also to use it as a tool to measure their performance, whether it's on the governance side, how many independent directors do they have, how many women on the board of the companies, how open are they when we meet them as an investor, through to if there's a specific issue around the environment, or they've chosen to start to report on carbon, or we're reporting their carbon on our behalf to kind of do the analysis around their carbon footprint. Are they making inroads to improve over time? We recognize it's a journey, so we want to see our portfolio companies find one or two areas that they can really improve upon. And we've had some great success. One of our early portfolio companies, a jewelry retailer we've mentioned before, PNJ. Actually, at the conference, the head of sustainability thanked Dynam for helping them on their journey, how they get to think about putting an ESG committee in place. What does ESG mean for a jewelry company? And then it stayed very different for one of our other companies, a port operator and a shipping company. What does it mean? What can they do? And we've spent a lot of time with our portfolio, really engaging with them to try and understand where they're at and where they need to get to. Because over time, particularly if Vietnam has ambitions, as it does, to be in the emerging markets, proper indices, investors will expect a higher adherence, better carbon reporting, better governance. And so the companies that are already positioned in that way, we think will get re-rated. And therefore, selfishly, for Vietnam Holding as an early investor into these businesses, we will see some value uplift, over our investment period. So it's picking up battles, trying to find a few areas with each of the portfolio companies that we can use to, once we've filtered them and say, yeah, this is a company we've got conviction on, but these are the areas we think it can do better on, working with them to see if they can journey along with us. And if they do, great, maybe our conviction increases. If they don't, then maybe it's one to kind of exit sooner rather than later. But we recognize it's a journey. And for some businesses, there are surprises. There's transitions. So one of our companies we've added to recently in the portfolio used to be a big oil and gas company, Petro-Vietnam Shipping. It's a company that has, in the oil and gas space, a significant fleet of anchor handling tugs, these specialized ships, these specialized vessels that help you put in place an oil drilling pipeline or a gas exploration pipeline. That's where it's built its competence. But the company itself is transitioning to using that capability to install offshore wind farms or to help many countries, not just Vietnam, as they start to transition towards offshore renewable energy sources through wind. So it's a very interesting business in transition. And Vietnam as a country has said, right, we want to change our whole energy mix. Vietnam's got some short-term issues on energy because of the climate. It's got some midterm challenges. It needs to reduce its reliance on coal. But the long-term opportunity for Vietnam is to be an export hub for renewable energy. And so our portfolio company is well positioned because it will be doing the installation of offshore wind farms, the maintenance of offshore wind farms, and even potentially helping lay the longest power cable in the world from Vietnam to Singapore. Singapore, small island, has to import a lot of electricity, and Vietnam will have cheap renewable energy in abundance if it succeeds on the government's power plan. So exciting times for Vietnam, transition times. And so for many of our companies, John, they are still at various phases of that journey, and we want to encourage them to be better businesses.
Yeah, I think that's true of ESG the world over. I think even in developed markets, a lot of companies are still on that journey, and it sort of really marks in my mind that the fact that Vietnam is becoming a sort of a market that has standards on a par with Western companies. I think that must be an incredibly important aspect of what you're looking at.
It is, but as I say, the 1,600 companies, not all of them are at the same level. So in our portfolio, we're pleased that many of them are, and are increasing their own approach to ESG, which we distill as do more, measure more, report more. That's what we do for our investors in Vietnam Holding. But we encourage our portfolio companies to do the same, because they're also public companies and they need to attract the younger generation of investors, the internationally minded investors. And so a few of them are ahead of the game, and a few of them have still got some work to do. And some may not get there, and there will be the ones that over time, our conviction will change, and we'll sadly have to kind of exit them. But those that do could be great compounders for Vietnam Holding. And in the 3 to 5 years to come, I think they could deliver tremendous value economically to us and our shareholders, but also in terms of their position within the Vietnam ecosystem, and particularly observing what's happening on climate, which no one can escape. Super hot, the heat is on in Saigon. This year could be record temperatures in Vietnam, has some adverse consequences. Vietnam relies on hydropower. A lot of those water resources are depleted because of the heat. So Vietnam recognizes it needs to transition to its mix of energy. And many of our portfolio companies have a role to play in that, some larger than others.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things you mentioned focus on in the statement is PDP8, which is the new plan to improve the grid. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because this seems to me to be fundamental to not just to your investments, but to Vietnam's economic development more generally.
Absolutely. And it's been quite some time in coming, and it's gone through a number of iterations. So Vietnam needs power. It's 100 million people, big domestic economy. It's a big production center for the world's goods. It's a big hub in the global supply chain. Historically, until 10 years ago, renewable energy did not feature in that. Okay, the country had a lot of hydropower, but very little or no wind, no solar. But in the last few years, that's changed dramatically. And so Vietnam has really tilted towards increasing access for solar farms and wind farms, with plans in the new PDP-8, the new power plant, for that to increase even more dramatically. And it's going to require hundreds of billions of dollars of investment for wind and for solar. Obviously, these are capital intensive. It also needs investment in the public space for distribution of that electricity, for improving the grid stability and the access to that renewable energy. So it's going to be a partnership between the government spending its money on building essential services and infrastructure, and then foreign investors coming in, particularly to focus on wind and solar, as well as in the interim on gas and lower carbon type energy sources as the country looks to phase out coal. So the country really needs PDP-8, this new plan, to help it achieve its net zero by 2050 goal, which the Prime Minister announced a couple of years ago at COP26 in Glasgow. So the country today, very reliant on coal, has to add some coal power to meet its energy demands in the short midterm, but by 2050 will be net zero. So coal will be completely turned off, and then wind, solar, and other sources of renewable energy will be increasingly important. And it's massive amounts of energy. And as I said earlier, it will have surplus potential. And that's why it's looking to see how can it contribute to the ASEAN, that's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, to their grid. And Singapore might well be the first kind of recipient of that kind of export of clean electricity. So Vietnam needs the power domestically for its continued success story as a key exporter, this made in Vietnam journey, which is continuing as companies move out from China and focus on Vietnam, but also for its growing domestic economy. And as the country urbanizes, we've spoken about this before, Vietnam's urbanization rate is 38%. That's where Western Europe was 70 years ago. It's where China was 20 years ago. So as Vietnam modernizes and the economy grows, it needs to secure a strong, cleaner power base. And that's partly what PDP-8, this new power plan, is seeking to do. So it's good for the environment, it's good for Vietnam, it's going to require a lot of investment, a lot of work, a lot of multilateral support from ADB and other financing entities. But if they can achieve some, and hopefully all of what they set out in PDP-8, then it's going to be a big transition towards a low carbon economy for Vietnam in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's that demand that the fact that this is such a necessary level of investment, reflecting that the demand for electricity that I find really fascinating about the Vietnam story, that there is so much further to go, that it's at the beginning, as I think I've said, in the foothills of its economic transformation.
It's at the foothills. There are some challenges with that, because with the increased urbanization, obviously that's people coming into the cities. The opportunities and the challenges, obviously, these things always walk hand in hand. You'll need more supermarkets, you'll need more schools, hospitals, more building. And if you can create that ecosystem using lower carbon techniques and maybe even lower carbon materials, then you're providing greater economic stimulus. But it could mean more air conditioning, which means more electricity and more electric gadgets. And as you have more convenience stores and supermarkets, more freezers and refrigeration units, more electricity. So it's a catch-up game all the way along. So it's a trend which is going to continue. Vietnam is at this inflection point. $4,000 per capita GDP. China doubled from that in 6 years. 38% urbanization, that was China 20 years ago. China doubled its urbanization level within 20 years. So Vietnam's on the up and up. It will require huge amounts of investment and domestic infrastructure, but it has a multiplier effect. So it will continue to boost Vietnam's economy over many, many years to come.
Yeah. Do you think Vietnam has an advantage in the sense that perhaps because it's sort of further behind on this journey than somewhere, say, say like China and particularly the West, that it has more of a blank canvas to work from, that it can put the infrastructure in place now that perhaps isn't there now, that will really give it an advantage in years to come?
Well, I think actually some of these things are outside of a country's remit and its serendipity. So Vietnam, you can see the picture behind me, has a very long coastline and has tremendous wind potential. So as the wind blows in, there's a lot to capture, both onshore, which is currently being done, near shore, so just close to the coastline, and then offshore. So that's part of the endowment of its geography. Also, the sun shines a lot. It's very hot and sunny. And so it's well suited to capture of solar. So each country has to play to its natural advantages. Iceland probably plays to geothermal advantages, other countries to different types of advantages. For Vietnam, great location for wind, great location for solar. So it can adapt to these newer technologies. Other countries might need to require, other types of wind, or other types of solar, or may need to import, or may even need to look at nuclear in the future. Whereas I think Vietnam can probably get there with a renewable plan and probably LNG in the short term to kind of replace the reliance on coal. So it's working with what it has, but Vietnam is also in a very good position to learn from other countries, to see what's worked in other places, not make the same mistakes. Yeah, exactly. So exactly to your point there, John, yeah, it does have an advantage. It can play catch up and play catch up very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's perhaps turn to what's going on in Vietnam at the moment, rather than looking towards the future. And it's been a better month. I mean, there's obviously still some sort of broad economic concerns, not just with Vietnam but around the world. But things seem to be on the up again in the last report.
Yeah, we're cautiously optimistic. We may have kind of bottomed out of recent period of weakness generally in Vietnam. That's obviously partly because of the global circumstances and fears on slowing demand, perhaps having concern in people's minds around trade, but also some homegrown issues that Vietnam launched on itself last year, with efforts to control perhaps some rogue areas in the nascent bond market, and ended up freezing the real estate market. And that's going to take some time to kind of unthaw. But we're seeing some early warning signs, or early encouraging signs, I should say, that things are picking up. We're also seeing tourism return to Vietnam in a big way, and the government just has announced longer stays for British citizens without need for visas, and trying to encourage tourism to grow back to the levels it was at pre-COVID, pre-pandemic. And if Vietnam can sort out, unblock some of the issues around the real estate segment, and it's doing so by trying to streamline processing of real estate projects, trying to tighten up the bond issuance regulation. But we also are seeing, which is very important, domestic enthusiasm for the stock market return. And Vietnam is very much reliant on the domestic investors, the retail investors, that account for maybe 80 to 90% of investors in Vietnam. And over the last few months, we've seen much more activity from them. And we've seen liquidity in the stock market on a daily basis increase significantly. So yeah, things are looking up. We've seen the prospects for a number of our businesses, despite weak news globally still, worries of recession in the US and Europe. We've seen many of them print some quite interesting numbers in their business plans for the year. So we're cautiously optimistic that the worst is behind. The portfolio trades on less than 10 times PE, price to earnings, for the full year. And we're still looking at north of 20% earnings per share growth for the portfolio. Add to that, for Vietnam Holding, we're trading at a discount to our NAV. So despite all the good things in the stocks that we have, you can buy all that great story on the London Stock Exchange at a maybe 15% discount to the net asset value. So there's even some additional potential upside there for UK investors.
Yeah, and you've been making efforts to create the liquidity required to give investors room to come into the fund.
Yeah, so the board of the fund, that are independent to the manager, they do regular share buybacks and to try and narrow the discount. They keep an eye on that. They're very active around that. Every few years, the fund has done tender offers close to NAV, which has supported and shown investors that the board are very interested and take this very seriously. And then every 5 years, investors get a chance to vote on the continuation. We have one of those coming up later this year. So, we're always, the board and us as a manager are always very much focused on what's important for our shareholders in Vietnam Home.
Yeah, and it's a fantastic story still, the Vietnam story as a whole, but really fantastic to see how you're driving that ESG agenda in Vietnam. It's not just taking you forward, but taking the whole country forward. So, no, congratulations on the successful conference. Thank you. And great speaking to you again.
It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Greg.